Time to replace the cam belt on the Ford Territory diesel. This is a SZ2 2015. Same applies to all of the diesel Territories. Same whether it's a two-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. In this video, I will cover 1, replacement parts, 2, how to remove and install your cam belt, your timing belt, 3, how to replace the belt driving your high-pressure fuel pump. From the Ford service manual out of the glove box, when is the cam belt due? Every 10 years or 165,000 kilometers. It's for the cam belts. For the fuel pump drive belt, well, that's 10 years as well. What parts do you need? Well, I can show you what came off my car, the original equipment. As always, I'll leave part numbers in the description, both the original Ford part numbers and links to the places where I've bought the parts I needed. Firstly, the fuel pump belts. Yes, you'll see why it's cut later. It is 20 millimeters wide. Okay, so you want a belt that's 20 millimeters wide and has 82 teeth. Careful, because other AJDV6s use 84 or 80 tooth belts. Original equipment is Dayco, made in Italy. The original tensioner for the fuel pump, Dayco have sourced this from Koyo, K-O-Y-O, made in Japan. And there's our part number. Has this tang underneath, and it is 60 millimeters diameter, 26 millimeters. And with the fuel pump kit, notice it has this pin. It's very important you keep that pin in place. There's no way of adjusting your tension once you pull that pin out. And just checking, we've got that 82 tooth belt by 20 millimeters wide. And of course you want a cam belt. This one, again, Dayco, made in Italy. It is 195 teeth long, and it is 30 millimeters wide. And your cam belt tensioner, Ford part number, there, is 69 millimeters and 34 millimeters wide. Cam belt idlers are again 69 millimeters by 34 millimeters again. It's a really good idea to replace the tensioner with the cam belt, because a tensioner failure will also destroy your engine. This Dayco kit's tensioner is made in Japan. Replacing the idler bearings is optional. I'll also be replacing the auxiliary belt while I'm there. The auxiliary belt, original equipment, focus, 6PK1977. Access to the cam belt is pretty good. We'll take out some of these things to improve access. First, we'll remove that engine cover. Next, we're going to remove this cover here. So there's clips holding this one along the top, and then underneath these tabs, you just need to push these tabs. Disconnect the negative terminal from the battery. The manual recommends draining the cooling system and removing some of the pipes to improve access. I will skip that step. Might create more problems than it solves. So I'm going to leave that alone and see if I can get by without it. Remove some of these intake pipes to create some room, including the throttle elbow. And we'll pop that one off. Next, we'll remove this throttle elbow. We'll remove some of these hoses. And there's an 8mm bolt just here. There's a metal clip retaining this on here. Just reach down the side here and pop that up. See, it's got these little tabs on the bottom that you can pull up. Remove this screw. Remove this bracket There are some 8mm bolts above and below. Also 2 T25 hexes supporting the EGR pipe. For this longer stud here, you'll need a long 8mm. So that's given us plenty of access. Draining the cooling system would allow you to remove several of these hoses. And once those hoses were out of the way, you would be able to remove the fan assembly as well, just 2 clips holding that in. So I'm going to leave that alone. I'm going to leave the coolant hoses alone and work with the space I've got there, which I think is plenty. I'll make a quick sketch of the routing of that belt. Owner's manual has a diagram of the belt layout. Before I remove the auxiliary belt, I will loosen the pulley bolts, helping to hold those pulleys in place. We're using a Torx E12. I'll be replacing the auxiliary belt at the same time. If you're reusing your old one, mark on the front of that belt. That way you can put it back on with the same orientation. Now to remove the auxiliary belt, first you'll need to remove the tension from that belt. This is the tensioner down here. Tensioner has a square hole in it there, which will accept a 3/8 ratchet. Then those pulleys can come out. You do not need to remove the auxiliary belt tensioner. Now we're ready to remove that timing cover. It is in 3 pieces. It's held in by 8mm bolts. Now there's enough room to take those covers off. Count them off, there should be 16 bolts altogether, including one in the middle of each. Around the outside they have springs to retain the bolts, so that's nice. You don't have to worry about getting them back in the right place. Timing covers are off. Now we have access to the cam belt itself. Next step is to get the engine in time. So this is a critical step, turning the engine over until the markers are lined up and we can lock those cams. So I'm using a 21mm socket and turning the engine over clockwise. Why clockwise? Well, I know for one thing you don't want to undo the crank pulley bolt, right? So on each camshaft, we need to line up the slot with a hole in the block. And that is our timing mark. There is one on each side. Okay, so we need to turn this until we get to about 7 o'clock on this side, 5 o'clock on the other side. I'm using some 5mm hex keys, and those will slide in there. There we go, that's in time. And you'll know that's in time. That is about 5 centimeters into that hole. Locked on both sides. Note, within the slot, there is a smaller hole on the actual crankshaft. This is just the slot for the pulley. So that's the camshafts locked in place. What about the crankshaft? The Ford manual says remove the starter motor and install the special tool to lock the crankshaft in place. I won't be doing that. What I'm going to do instead is mark the crankshaft on the pulley down here. Mark it. That won't stop it from moving, but with that mark in place, I will know if it is moved. So that is marked in place. Next step, this is important. Don't skip this. Loosen these 3 bolts. Now don't worry that you're going to throw the timing out. This pin is locking the camshaft. The pulley itself is independent, held in place by these bolts. You need to loosen these bolts so that when we put the cam belt on, we're not tensioning this pulley against the camshaft. Okay, this is a mistake people make, and you end up, if you skip this step, you risk snapping this pulley off at these spokes. Again, you're not throwing the timing out by loosening these bolts. The camshaft itself is pinned in time. And to release these 13mm bolts, we're just breaking them loose, we're not removing them. I'm just allowing it to slide around. So you don't want to lever against this pin. You want to hold it in place with a spanner. So this is a 13mm socket and an 18mm spanner. They're not very tight. We can remove the cam belt now. We do that by relaxing the tensioner. 17mm socket. There we go, tension's come off there. Oh, and I suppose I need to take that off as well. That one comes out. And now the belt comes off. No play. Reinstallation. Installing this, we're not doing it up tight because we haven't put tension on it yet. So just finger tight. Tightening up the two idler pulleys for the cam belts. Those go to 45 Newton meters. That's about 33 foot-pounds. This next step is also critical, the order in which you put the cam belt on over the pulleys. Make sure these are loose, right? So you want to clock them all the way clockwise. Okay, so this slot is all the way over here. That's because as you feed this on, you're going to wind it the other way. So we start at the crank pulley here, and we go in an anti-clockwise direction around these and back over the tensioner last. Okay, so that's on. Note these aren't in the same position anymore. They're slightly offset. That is why we've loosened these three bolts so that can move. And I'm also checking these marks are still in position on the crankshaft pulley. Gold, black. Those are lining up so the crank has not moved. The cams have not moved because they're locked. And the belt is in place. So next step is to tension the cam belt. You'll need a 10mm hex to put the tension on, and then your 15mm socket to tighten up the bolt and hold it in place. So what we need to do is turn this until, see that little notch lines up. So it needs to line up with that little bump on the alloy piece. While holding that tight, we're doing up that bolt. Then we're torquing the bolt to just 23 Newton meters. Okay, with that all in place, now we can torque the bolt holding the pulley to the camshaft. Again, you don't want to be putting torque on the pin. You want to use a spanner to hold that in place. 23 Newton meters. So as well as checking those marks on the pulley down here are all lined up, I'm also checking these still slide in and out. Everything's buttoned down, torqued up. Take out these two pins. Now we're going to turn the engine over twice on the crank pulley, which is one on the cam, one revolution on the cam pulley. Checking everything lines up again. Also checking that there's no binding, that there's no pistons hitting valves, etc. Change to the breaker bar to get a bit more control as we approach those marks again. Gone around twice, and these pins slot back in. Again, about 50mm they should go in. And the marks line up on the crank pulley. Putting things back together now. Start with this bracket. Covers go back on. I'll start with the bottom one, then the left, and the right last. Lots of 8mm bolts on the covers. Those go up to just 10 Newton meters. Those cam belt covers are back on. Next are the pulleys, torqued to 23 Newton meters. crankshaft damper pulley. There's a rubber layer around here. Check that isn't separating. The water pump pulley. Make sure you clean any grease or oil off there. 6 holes but only 3 bolts. It should be a mark from the old bolt on the correct hole. Tighten these to 25 Newton meters and on the water pump pulley. Auxiliary belt idler, 48 Newton meters torque. Next we'll put the auxiliary belt on. Of course, following that diagram you drew before. I like to finish on one of the smooth pulleys. Okay, so I've got that on. Putting on this smooth last. Now I'll turn it over a couple of times. And that 8mm down here. Those are back on, these are back on. Ready for some air ducts. All back together, battery connected. It's a good idea to road test the vehicle after doing the cam belt before doing the fuel pump belt. Next we'll do the fuel pump belt, located on the other side of the engine. Doesn't really have anything to do with the timing belt, except that it'll often come up as the question straight after, has the cam belt been done? The fuel pump is located on top of the engine here. It is driven off the cam, the end of the cam, via a belt that runs behind the engine here. It's only a short belt. It's fairly straightforward to remove. The only trick is it's located on the back of the engine. Reasonably good access. Still going to be fiddly though. I will still be working with a mirror to see what I'm doing. I'll take off this sound insulation sheet. So we're just popping out 2 plastic clips. Now that's all the manual says to take out of the way. I will take out a few more bits and pieces, take out some of these harnesses. I also want to loosen this, not to remove the fuel filter, but simply to reduce the chance of breaking a line. Not very difficult to remove, but there is the risk you will bend some pins and push down here. And then as you turn, it's physically pushing the connector out. That's all I want to do, just create a little bit more room. Just pop this whole bracket out. There's one tab back there to push in, and then this lifts up. That's it. So it's still sitting there. It just means if I push up on here, I'm less likely to break these lines. You pop these clips off that join the hoses. There's a few of them in here. That just gives a little bit more freedom in the movement of these. The fuel pump cover is just held in with 3 little metal clips, which are easily popped off. You can see one of them here, and there are 2 others. You pop those 3 clips off, and then the cover will fold out, and you can lift it out of its hinges at the bottom. Let's give this one a try. Yep, that's one out. 2. And that last clip, I've just used a very long screwdriver and gone in through this way. Has these 3 clips along the top, then these hinges along the bottom. Just fold it down and lift out. Next step is removing the old belt, the manual is to cut it out with a pair of pliers. It's a problem with service manuals. They don't tell you why. I'm guessing if you've still got tension on there, there's the potential to strip threads. These are the cutters I used. They're cable cutters. They worked. Hacked my way through the belt. Next we need to remove the old tensioner. This is the new one, but I'll be taking a bolt off there. It's a good place to lose tools, therefore it must be a 10. One bolt and one tensioner. There's the date stamp of 2014, so I'm confident I'm bleeding. Confident it's never been replaced, and you can't reuse these simply because you cannot retension them. Putting the new tensioner in, two things I have to be careful with. First is not to pull the pin, and the other is to get this tang located in the slot. But if you can, 25 Newton meters. I'll give it a go, see if I can get in there without losing the torque wrench. Here's the old one. Dayco, made in Italy, 20 millimeters wide, 82 teeth. Replacing it with Dayco, made in Italy, 82 teeth by 20 millimeters wide. That's installed. I need to check if my work's right. So let's feed the camera in there and have a look. Here's the scary bit, pulling the pin. Only get one shot at this, otherwise I have to get a new tensioner. Tensioner's out. There's the pin, it is pulled. The belt seems to be taut. I'll do a few more checks and then put the cover on. But I turned the engine over a few times and then rechecked the belt. Still seems to be on, hasn't popped off. Now it's time for this to go back on. Oh, that goes on a lot easier when it comes off. It's back in place. Reinstalling those clips and bits and pieces that I've taken out. All done. My biggest concern is not so much the belt, it's that I've broken a fuel line or a turn line somewhere. So I'll prime the engine and look for leaks before I start. Oh yeah, probably help if I connect the battery, eh? Okay, on to the second clip. Okay, just leave it there. Engine's all back together and running just fine. I must say it's a fairly straightforward job to do. There's nothing particularly difficult about it. The high pressure fuel pump especially, it's like 3 clips and 1 bolt. It's fiddly. It's difficult to access those clips. You can't see what you're doing, but it's still just 3 clips and 1 bolt. And the Ford Territory's got much better access than a lot of cars down the back of the engine there. So grab a mirror, get into it. The consequence of getting that timing belt wrong is potentially catastrophic for your engine. I spent a lot of time going through and double checking the points in this video. It is a critical job. Do your homework and satisfy yourself that what's covered here is correct. The Ford manuals, you can access them online. Join the Ford forum. Highly recommend it. A lot of very useful resources there, and they have all those the Ford Territory SZ manuals. I'll leave a link to that in the description. I am glad I decided not to drain the cooling system. There's plenty of room there. Don't need to drain the cooling system. Also note, you don't need to replace the water pump at the same time. By all means replace it, but it is not driven off the cam belt. A lot of engines, the cam belt drives the water pump. It's not the case for the AJDV6 in the Ford Territory diesel. And I must say that water pump's very easy to get to. Car's running really nicely, as usual. I do think these are good engines.